Answer the question, where do we see Aboriginal groups? It's going to include First Nations, which we think of those being similar to Native Americans, but also the Inuit. The Inuit not always are considered First Nations, but considered definitely Aboriginal or Indigenous, or essentially here before the Europeans arrived, before outsiders arrived. So they were here obviously well before the 1600s. However, over time, there's been displacement, there's been movement in which they've been kind of forced to certain areas of the country, or sorry, certain areas of the province as well, but also in the country of Canada. So in particular, we got some patterns. So we got some patterns from certain groups, certain First Nations and Inuit groups are found in certain parts of Quebec. So to go ahead and start off to do that, we'll use this proportional symbol map and now identify the North American Indian. This is the First Nations. So the First Nations, the group here is mostly the Algonquin, and we can see them. They're found there in Quebec and Montreal, so urban areas, but also throughout much of southern Quebec. Over here on the eastern side, this is the Innu, I-N-N-U. So they are more over here on the eastern part. There's a couple different groups of them, but they are a type of Algonquin, or the First Nations. Another type of Algonquin are the Cree, C-R-E-E, found over here more in the western part of Quebec, especially along the James Bay, which is located right here. Key to both these patterns as far as where they're located, typically on the mouths of the rivers. And these are groups who historically and still to this day, they depend on the land. They depend on the rivers for food sources. They depend on vegetation, berries, and so essentially they're kind of hunters and gatherers, kind of settlers that over time have adapted to the local climates and have lived in certain areas. What's interesting is on one side of the Continental Divide, for the most part, we see the Innu, and on the other side of the Continental Divide, we see in a different drainage basin pattern, we see the Cree. Now looking at the Métis are a mix of indigenous and European. We're going to find them overwhelmingly in southern Quebec, but they're in urban areas. And there are three main urban areas, particularly Quebec City and Montreal. The Métis, they're going to be more found in the other parts of Canada, Ontario and the western provinces. So they used to be here, but they're now found a little bit more in other parts of Canada. Finally, we get to the northern part, the Inuit, I-N-N-U-I-T. So these are, historically been called Eskimos, although it's kind of a bad term. But these are pretty much a group that lives in the very, very barren area of the world in which there's not much vegetation, not much food sources, and so they're very dependent on the short growing seasons, but they're also dependent on nearby marine life in terms of fish as a food source. And so you can see where they're located. They're not located in the middle of the continent. They're located along the coastline. Also, once again, where we see the mouths of rivers. So they're very much spread out, far, far away from this southern Quebec, the St. Lawrence lowland core area of the country. And we look at this particular area called Nunavik, which is a part of Quebec. It's a kind of this area in which they are distinct. They are obviously Inuit, and so it's kind of maybe, are they going to become maybe their own country? Quebec probably won't let that happen because of all the access to resources, particularly maybe some oil, but also transportation. That's a key corridor. So this is going to be an area in which it's going to be interesting to see how much they govern themselves, because we already have Quebec, which is an interesting country, or an interesting province in which it has its own regional autonomy. So here you have a group within a minority nation, let's say Quebec, within Quebec, that also wants some rule over itself as well.